quiet morning in a luxury condo complex. A black woman checked her mail. To her neighbor, this was a crime scene in the making. The 911 call was placed. They had no idea who they just provoked. The aroma of freshly ground Ethiopian Yirgacheffe coffee beans filled the air, a rich, earthy scent that was Dr. Evelyn Reed's favorite part of her morning ritual. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her fourth-floor apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the glass of a framed print of a Jean-Michel Basquiat piece. At 35, Evelyn had curated a life of deliberate calm and intellectual rigor. Her home, nestled within the ironically named the Serenity Gates, was her sanctuary. Polished concrete floors, a sprawling bookshelf organized by sociological theory, and minimalist furniture spoke of a mind that valued order and substance. She was dressed in her typical work-from-home attire, a simple silk blouse, comfortable linen trousers, and bare feet. On her large oak desk lay the scattered notes for the lecture she was preparing for her university students: power, privilege, and social structures. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, a pocket of peace before a day of online meetings and grading papers. A small chime from her phone reminded her that a package she'd been waiting for had been delivered. With a soft sigh, she set her mug down, slipped on a pair of leather loafers, and grabbed her keys. The walk from her door to the communal mailroom in the lobby was short, a brief journey through pristine, silent hallways that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and recycled air. As she stepped out into the meticulously landscaped courtyard that housed the resident mailboxes, the morning sun was warm on her skin. She spotted her package in the oversized parcel locker and retrieved it, along with a few envelopes. It was a mundane, everyday act, one performed by hundreds of residents. But she wasn't just any resident. Not to the woman sitting in the driver's seat of a gleaming white Lexus SUV parked in a visitor spot just 50 feet away. The woman, Carol Peterson, was in her late 50s, her face a mask of taut concentration, framed by a perfectly coiffed blonde bob. She wore a pastel pink tennis outfit, though the courts were empty. Her engine was off, but her gaze was laser-focused on Evelyn. Every movement, the turn of the key, the slide of the metal locker door, the casual flip through the letters, was cataloged and judged. Evelyn felt the weight of the stare, a familiar, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge it. Years of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned had taught her that reaction was a currency she couldn't afford to spend so freely. She simply turned, her package tucked under her arm, and began the short walk back to the lobby entrance. That's when the electric whir of a car window broke the silence. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, laced with an authority that assumed a response was required. Evelyn stopped and turned slowly. She met Carol's gaze, her expression placid. "Yes. Do you live here?" Carol's eyes narrowed, scanning Evelyn from head to toe, lingering on her simple attire, as if it were evidence. "I do," Evelyn replied, her voice even. "Which unit?" The question was an interrogation. Evelyn's calm didn't waver, but a cool resolve settled in her chest. She wasn't obligated to answer. "Why do you ask?" The simple, direct question seemed to fluster Carol. Her authority was being questioned, not answered. "I'm just concerned about security. I've never seen you before." "I've lived here for 6 months," Evelyn stated, a simple fact that hung in the air like an accusation. Carol's lips thinned. Without another word, she rolled her window up. The tinted glass became a mirror, reflecting Evelyn's solitary figure back at her. Inside, Carol picked up her phone. Her thumb moved with practiced speed across the screen. Evelyn stood there for a moment, the sun on her face, the weight of the package in her arms. She knew what was happening. It was a script she had studied her entire professional life, and now she was its unwilling protagonist. She took a deep, steadying breath and walked back into her building. She hadn't even reached the elevator when the first distant, piercing wail of a siren began to cut through the morning serenity. The siren grew from a faint cry to a gut-wrenching scream, culminating in an abrupt halt directly in front of the building. Through the lobby's glass doors, Evelyn watched as a black and white patrol car parked at an angle, its lights painting the manicured hedges in strobing flashes of red and blue. Two officers emerged. The first, Officer Miller, was older, with a thick mustache and a weary, impassive expression that suggested he'd seen it all and was impressed by none of it. The second, Officer Evans, was much younger, his face still holding a hint of rookie eagerness, mixed with a visible tension in his jaw. Evelyn didn't wait for them to buzz. She walked back outside, meeting them on the stone pathway. She chose the ground, refusing to be cornered in the lobby. "Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity," Officer Miller began, his voice a flat monotone. He stopped a few feet from her, his hand resting casually on his belt, near his service weapon. Officer Evans stood slightly behind him, his eyes darting from Evelyn to Carol's SUV, where the window had once again rolled down. "Suspicious in what way?" Evelyn asked, her tone genuinely curious, as if she were a researcher gathering data. "Reports of a possible trespasser, someone checking mailboxes who might not belong here," Miller said, his gaze flicking toward the mail area. Evelyn looked at her own front door, just visible through the lobby glass. "This is my home," she said, gesturing with her free hand. "I was checking my own mail." "You have proof of that?" Miller's question was rote, but the challenge was clear. "Of course." Evelyn didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes. She reached in her pocket, pulled out her phone, and with a few taps, brought up the digital lease agreement for apartment 4B. She held it out. The screen glowed with her name, the unit number, the management company's letterhead, a constellation of facts. Officer Miller leaned in, his eyes squinting at the screen. His expression flickered for a fraction of a second, a hint of something, maybe annoyance, maybe surprise, before settling back into a stony mask. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the proof. He simply moved to the next step of the script. "I'm gonna need to see some ID." "Certainly." Evelyn handed over her driver's license. As Miller examined it, comparing the photo to her face, Officer Evans walked over to Carol's car. The murmur of their conversation was too low to hear, but Carol's animated gestures were visible. She pointed at Evelyn, then at the mailboxes, her face a pantomime of civic duty and alarm. Evans came back, his expression even more strained. He gave a slight nod to Miller. "Everything matches up, sir." The caller just said she'd never seen her before and thought it was odd. "Odd," Evelyn repeated softly, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Miller handed her license back. "All right, ma'am. Thanks for your cooperation. Looks like it was just a misunderstanding." He turned, ready to leave, the entire incident a minor blip in his day, already forgotten. But Evelyn hadn't forgotten. This was the moment, the pivot, the point where the script could be flipped. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice cutting through the air with a new, steely edge. He stopped, turning back with a look of mild irritation. "I'll need your badge number. And your name, spelled out, please." The air shifted. The casual dismissal evaporated, replaced by a tense, crackling silence. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, your badge number, and Officer Evans as well," Evelyn clarified, her gaze unwavering. She looked directly at the younger officer, who flinched almost imperceptibly. "I am filing a formal complaint for wrongful detainment based on racial profiling. I want this entire stop documented officially." "Now, hold on," Miller started, his tone shifting from bored to defensive. "We were just responding to a call. It's our job, and it's my right to live in my own home without being treated like a criminal because of a neighbor's prejudice," Evelyn countered, her voice dangerously calm. "Your job is also to de-escalate, to assess, and to recognize a baseless complaint when you see one. You failed to do that, so I will have your names and badge numbers." The power dynamic had been completely inverted. She was no longer the suspect. She was the citizen holding the authorities accountable. Officer Evans, looking deeply uncomfortable, stepped forward. "He's right, sir," Evans said quietly to Miller, before looking at Evelyn. "I apologize, ma'am. This stop was unnecessary." He reached for his notepad. "My name is Evans, EVNS, badge number 724. Miller glared at his partner, then back at Evelyn, his jaw tight. Defeated, he recited his own name and number, the words clipped and resentful. Evelyn recorded them meticulously in a note on her phone. Then, she looked past them, her gaze locking onto Carol, who was now standing beside her open car door, watching the scene unfold with a horrified expression. "And I will also need the name of the caller," Evelyn announced, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I have a right to know who is harassing me." The request for the caller's name was a grenade tossed into the fragile piece. Carol visibly recoiled, her face paling beneath her sun-kissed tan. Officer Miller, now fully on the defensive, quickly interjected, "Ma'am, that's confidential information." "Not when it's part of a pattern of harassment," Evelyn retorted, her legal footing firm. "And not when it leads to a police action that I am formally contesting. It becomes part of the record." By now, the scene had attracted an audience. A curtain twitched in a second-floor window. A man on his way to the gym paused by the lobby door, his headphones now hanging around his neck. On a balcony on the 5th floor, a young woman had her phone out, its small black lens aimed directly at the unfolding drama. The Serenity Gates were no longer serene. Carol, seeing the attention, finally stepped away from the protective shell of her Lexus. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "I was just being a concerned neighbor. You're taking this way too far." "No, ma'am," Evelyn replied, turning her full attention to Carol. "The officers became secondary. You took it too far when you saw a black woman in your apartment complex, and your first thought was criminal, not neighbor. You took it too far when you chose to call 911 instead of simply saying, 'Hello, I don't think we've met.'" Just as Carol opened her mouth to argue, a new player entered the arena. Mr. Henderson, a portly man in his 60s with a comb-over and a permanently disappointed expression, bustled out of the lobby. As the head of the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, he carried an air of self-importance that far exceeded his actual authority. All right. What's all the commotion here?" he announced, inserting himself between Evelyn and the officers. "Let's all just calm down. We're a community here." He turned to Evelyn, his tone patronizingly placating. "Young lady, I'm sure Mrs. Peterson meant no harm. She's just very vigilant about security." "Mr. Henderson," Evelyn said, her voice dangerously low, "are you suggesting that my presence requires this level of vigilance?" "Well, no, of course not. But in this day and age, you can't be too careful," he blustered, clearly siding with Carol. "We don't need this kind of conflict. Let's just shake hands and move on." This was the second front of the battle. Not just the state, but the community's self-appointed gatekeepers. The ones who valued superficial peace over actual justice. "With all due respect, Mr. Henderson," Evelyn said, her sociologist mind firing on all cylinders, "what we don't need is residents being subjected to harassment. In fact, I believe Article 4, Section 7 of the Serenity Gates HOA bylaws, which I took the liberty of reading upon moving in, explicitly prohibits any action by a resident that infringes upon another resident's right to quiet enjoyment of their property, including baseless accusations and targeted harassment." Does that sound familiar? Mr. Henderson's jaw went slack. He stared at her, utterly speechless. He was a man who lived by rules and regulations, and she had just used them as a weapon against him. The tide had turned completely. The young woman on the balcony was now very obviously recording. Officer Evans was scribbling furiously in his notepad, documenting the entire exchange. Officer Miller just looked tired, as if he wanted to be anywhere else. The final blow was the silence. No one rushed to defend Carol or Mr. Henderson. They stood isolated in the courtyard, their authority and assumptions dismantled in public. Carol, her face burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation, finally broke. She muttered something under her breath, scrambled back in her Lexus, and sped out of the parking lot with a squeal of tires. Mr. Henderson, avoiding Evelyn's gaze, mumbled about needing to inspect a sprinkler head and beat a hasty retreat back into the lobby. The officers were left. "We will file a report, ma'am," Evans said, his voice full of a newfound respect. "I expect a copy," Evelyn said. They nodded, and without another word, returned to their car and drove away, the flashing lights now switched off. The silence they left behind was heavier, more profound than the peace that had existed before. That evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across Evelyn's living room. She sat not at her desk, but on her sofa, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She wasn't angry anymore. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a deep, familiar weariness. It was the exhaustion of the perpetually vigilant, the fatigue of having to be twice as composed, twice as prepared, just to exist. The incident hadn't just stolen her morning. It had levied a tax on her soul. A soft knock echoed from her front door. Her body tensed. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But curiosity, the scholar's impulse, won out. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Carol. She looked different without the protective armor of her SUV. Her expensive tennis outfit had been replaced by a simple beige cardigan and slacks. Her shoulders were slumped, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. The aggressive certainty from the morning was gone, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable vulnerability. Evelyn opened the door, but didn't invite her in. She simply stood in the doorway, creating a physical and emotional threshold. "Dr. Reed," Carol began, her voice barely a whisper. She'd clearly done her homework, looked up the name on the mailbox. I wanted to apologize." Evelyn waited, her silence a prompt for more. "I was out of line this morning. I didn't know you lived here, and I made an assumption. It was wrong." "You didn't ask," Evelyn replied, her voice neutral. "It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact." Carol nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "You're right. I wasn't thinking. I just saw and I reacted." "Oh, I believe you were thinking, Carol," Evelyn said, and her voice, though still quiet, took on the incisive clarity of a lecture. "You were engaging in a well-documented sociological phenomenon known as unconscious bias. Your brain, conditioned by a lifetime of societal cues and media portrayals, saw a black person in a space you perceive as predominantly white and flagged it as an anomaly, a potential threat. You didn't see a neighbor or a fellow resident. You saw a stereotype." Carol looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and confusion. She had come expecting a simple transaction, an apology offered, an absolution received. She was not prepared for a diagnosis. "That's not," she stammered. "I'm not a racist. I didn't say you were," Evelyn continued calmly. "I'm explaining the mechanism behind your actions. The thought process is often subconscious, but the impact is very real. The impact was 2 police officers at my door. The impact was my neighbors watching me be interrogated for the crime of collecting my own mail. Your thoughts may be your own, but your actions have consequences in the real world for real people." A heavy silence fell between them. The air in the hallway felt thick and still. "So," Evelyn concluded, her voice softening slightly, not with forgiveness, but with a final, weary instruction. "I don't need your apology. Apologies are for making the apologizer feel better. What I need, what this community needs, is your promise. A promise that next time your brain sends you that flawed, prejudiced signal, you will stop. You will think. You will question your own assumptions before you inflict them on someone else. Because the next person you call the cops on might not be a university professor who knows the HOA bylaws by heart. They might not be as calm as me. And your misunderstanding could cost them far more than a peaceful morning." Carol stood there, stripped of her excuses. The words had hit their mark. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I understand," she said. And for the first time, it sounded like she might actually be starting to. She turned and walked away without another word. Evelyn watched her go, then slowly closed her door, the lock clicking into place with a heavy finality. The next morning, Evelyn woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The weariness had been replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The confrontation in the courtyard was merely round one. The apology was a footnote. The real fight was systemic, and she intended to engage with it on its own terms, with documentation, procedure, and relentless follow-through. Her first call was to an old friend from graduate school, Marcus, now a senior attorney for a prominent civil rights organization. She laid out the entire incident, from Carol's first question to her hollow apology. Classic living while black case, Marcus said, his voice grim but supportive. You handled it perfectly on the ground. Now, we build the paper trail so high they can't ignore it. You have the officers' names and badge numbers. In a video, Evelyn added, a neighbor on the 5th floor sent me the file last night. It captures everything from the moment Henderson showed up. Gold, Marcus breathed. Absolute gold. Okay, here's the plan. 2 fronts, the police department and the HOA. For the police, we file a formal citizen's complaint with the Internal Affairs Division. Don't just email it. Go there in person. Hand them a printed, signed copy. Attach a transcript of the events, stills from the video, and a copy of your lease. Demand a formal investigation and a written response. And the HOA? Evelyn asked, already typing notes. Even more important in some ways, Marcus replied. They're the ones who cultivate the environment. Write a formal letter to the HOA board. Name Carol Peterson and Mr. Henderson specifically. Quote the bylaw you threw at Henderson. Detail his biased intervention and Carol's initial harassment. Don't just ask for an apology. Demand action. Ask what steps the board will take to ensure this doesn't happen again. Request they issue a community-wide statement reaffirming their anti-harassment policy. You're not just a victim. You're a resident demanding the board uphold its fiduciary duty to protect all members of the community. For the next several hours, Evelyn worked with the precision of a research scientist. She transcribed the video, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wrote 2 separate, meticulously detailed letters. The one to the police department was factual and cold, citing the time, the officers' names, and a legal basis for her complaint of racial profiling. The one to the HOA was equally factual, but framed in the language of community and governance, appealing to their own stated principles. She printed everything in triplicate, organized it into 2 neat folders, and drove downtown. At the police headquarters, a sterile, imposing building, she was met with bureaucratic indifference until she asked for the Internal Affairs supervisor by name, a name Marcus had given her. Suddenly, doors opened. She sat across from a stern-faced sergeant, handed him the folder, and calmly stated, I expect this to be investigated thoroughly. I will be following up in 7 business days. Her next stop was the management office that handled the HOA. She handed the second folder to the community manager, a woman who looked increasingly alarmed as Evelyn explained the situation. The board meets next week, Evelyn finished. I expect this to be the first item on their agenda. She walked away from both encounters feeling not triumphant, but methodical. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about leveraging the levers of power. She had taken their systems, their rules, their procedures, and turned them into a mirror, forcing them to look at their own reflection. She had refused to be a passive victim. She had become an active, undeniable problem they were now legally and contractually obligated to solve. The ball was in their court, but she had built the court, written the rules of the game, and was now serving as the umpire. Weeks turned into a month. Life at the Serenity Gates settled into a new, tentative normal. Evelyn noticed a change in the subtle currents of the community. People who had previously offered curt, barely their nods in the hallway, now met her eyes. A few even offered warm, genuine smiles. The man from the gym gave her a thumbs up one morning. The young woman from the 5th floor balcony waved to her from across the courtyard. She was no longer an anomaly. She was Dr. Reed from 4B. Then, the official responses began to arrive. An email from the police department's Internal Affairs Division landed in her inbox. The investigation was closed. Her complaint was officially sustained. Officer Miller's conduct was deemed to have failed to meet the department's standards for impartial policing. He was scheduled for mandatory, comprehensive anti-bias and de-escalation training. Officer Evans, conversely, was commended in the report for his professionalism and for attempting to de-escalate the situation. The system, slow and creaking, had moved. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a tangible consequence. The second response was more public. A new notice appeared on the corkboard in the mailroom, printed on the HOA's official letterhead. It was also emailed to every resident. Titled, reaffirming our commitment to a respectful and inclusive community. The letter was a strongly worded condemnation of harassment in all its forms. It explicitly referenced the bylaws Evelyn had cited and stated a zero-tolerance policy for any resident infringing upon another's right to safety and peace. But it didn't stop there. The final paragraph announced a new initiative, a series of voluntary online workshops for residents, focused on building a more inclusive community and understanding unconscious bias. The first workshop was scheduled for the following month, and in a move that made Evelyn pause and read the sentence twice, the board had invited Dr. Evelyn Reed to be the guest speaker and moderator for the inaugural session. They weren't just placating her, they were empowering her. They were asking her to lead. That evening, Evelyn walked to the mailboxes to retrieve her mail. The sun was setting, bathing the courtyard in a soft, golden light. As she walked back, another resident, a woman she'd never spoken to, held the lobby door open for her. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Of course, neighbor," the woman replied with a smile. The word hung in the air. Neighbor. It was simple, but it was everything. It wasn't just about being seen anymore. It was about belonging. A sense of belonging she hadn't just been granted, but had actively fought for, and in doing so, had carved out more space for others to belong, too. She had faced down prejudice not with anger, but with intelligence, and had proven that one person's refusal to accept the status quo could, in fact, begin to change it. Evelyn's story shows us that fighting back against bias isn't just about courage. It's about strategy. It reminds us that true community safety comes from mutual respect, not baseless suspicion. What are your thoughts on how we can all work to build more inclusive spaces? Your voice matters in this conversation. Please share your ideas and always comment with respect. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to see more stories of strength and change.